Following the death of President Ebrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash in May, Iranian voters will go to the polls on Friday, June 28th, to choose a replacement. This contest, which comes not long after legislative elections earlier this year saw a low turnout and many reformist figures disqualified, will take place amid a backdrop of heightened political tension and international scrutiny. This coming election is significant because it will not only shape Iran's domestic political landscape, it promises to influence the country's relationships with the international community. Economic sanctions, Iran's nuclear program, and its role in the wider Middle East are just a few of the burning issues that form the backdrop to this contest. 6 candidates have been approved by the country's Guardian Council to compete in the presidential race. They are Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakir Kalibaf, former nuclear negotiator Saeed Jalili, Tehran Mayor Ali Reza Zakani, former Interior and Justice Minister Mustafa Pourmohammadi, Amir Hossein Ghazizadeh Hashemi, head of Iran's Foundation of Martyrs and Veterans Affairs, and the reformist candidate Masoud Pezeshkian. This lineup reflects the broader ideological battles within the country as hardliners and reformists vie for influence. Welcome to the Year of Elections, a podcast series brought to you by the Opinion Desk at The National. I'm Declan McVeigh, speaking to you from our studio here in Abu Dhabi, and this week we delve into Iran's presidential election. We will explore the candidates, their backgrounds, and what their potential presidencies could mean for Iran and the region. Joining me to provide in-depth analysis of this critical contest are Ismaeel Naar, the National's Arab Affairs editor, and Arash Azizi, who is an author, historian, and Iranian affairs columnist for The National. Arash and Ismaeel, thank you very much for joining me today. Arash, if I can start with you, Iran is something of a distinct governing system. As a long-term observer of Iranian politics, would you explain the role of the presidency for our listeners, the powers the president will have, and how might the winner of this election expect to operate in the context of Iran's other influential institutions?
The Islamic Republic has a very strange system, but it's also have never been a stable system. So it's not like people have roles and they go to their roles and they act as expected. Under the ideal conditions, if you will, the supreme leader is supposed to be a big head of a state who puts down the general trends of policies, and the president is a daily caretaker, basically. And even if everything is according to the constitution, I would say 70-80% of the power rests with the unelected supreme leader, and is the president who's going to be the caretaker. In reality, however, obviously presidents are directly elected by the people. They often represent something very different from what the supreme leader wants, and they can use this daily caretaking work, right? Like the fact that they appoint most cabinet ministries, they pick the secretary of the National Security Council, they pick the obviously foreign minister. They are the person who is meeting foreign leaders. They can use this to further their political goals. And the regime, the Islamic Republic, has always had a lot of infighting, basically, within its different factions, right? Different elites and different factions. So that plays into it. Long story short, I can just give you this one simple fact that Ayatollah Khamenei, the current supreme leader who's been in charge since 1989, he has clashed with every single president. And by clash, I don't mean they had a disagreement over the budget. Basically, every single former president of the Islamic Republic, with the exception of Raisi, who died in this helicopter crash, every single one has come into a very dramatic clash with Khamenei. It's basically persona non grata now. And Rafsanjani died, but before he died, he was refused to run for presidency again, and he was really an adversary of Khamenei and of the system. So it basically tells you that this is a ride that has never gone smoothly, really, and there is a situation of there's basically a situation of dual power in some ways, of Khamenei having so much power as an unelected person, and this clashing with the president anytime this president wants to do something based on the electorate who elect him.
I think you've done a good job there of explaining the nuts and bolts and the context of this election. I was wondering, Arash, could you give us an insight into its significance, particularly in the context of President Ebrahim Raisi's untimely death?
So Ebrahim Raisi was an exception to the rule that I just said, in a sense that he was really the first president since the 1990s who was effectively not elected but coronated. The elections for him, everyone knew who the winner was beforehand. It was very clear. That's because no serious candidate was allowed to run against him. Now, he did run in an election, but none of the serious candidates of other factions were allowed to run. Of course, there's a body in Iran called the Guardian Council. All of whose members are clerics and jurists directly or indirectly appointed by Supreme Leader Khamenei, and this body gets to decide who gets to run. So that was the case. Now, with Raisi's untimely death, the race has opened up a little bit. Now, in no way, this does not mean the Guardian Council would allow the opponents of the regime or anybody else who's a critic of Khamenei to run. It's still a very narrow field. Everyone competes in declaring loyalty to Khamenei. That includes the only one reformist candidate who was allowed to run. But I can tell you now, 9 days to the elections, no one can claim that, I know for sure who's going to win. And it actually does matter what people do and whether they go to the polls and who do they vote for. So it's a bit of a more open election. It's a competition between, we can get to the candidates at any point that you want, but it's a competition between people representing different sections of the Iranian elite. And none of whom, I think the interesting thing is, from my perspective, none of whom is great for Khamenei in many ways. So I think he will have a lot of pros and cons about each and every one. So this makes it a very interesting. It's actually hard. If you ask me who is Khamenei's favorite candidate in this election, I don't think I could tell you either.
I think in your answer there, you've alluded to the existence of hardliners and reformers in the current lineup running to be president. Ismaeel, if I can bring you in here, your reporting on the leading contenders has suggested that the clerical establishment and the supreme leader will probably want a president similar to Mr. Raisi, a hardliner who is very distrustful of the US and Israel. How do you think the presence of both hardliners and reformists among the candidates will influence the outcome and future policies in Iran?
Yeah, Declan, I think that's a very interesting question to unpack. I think Arash mentioned this point in his interjection. When we're looking at the Iranian president and the crucial role that he plays in terms of the current country's policies, both domestic and regionally, because he's elected by the people, right? That adds a layer of legitimacy in a system that says everything goes through the supreme leader or is dictated or engineered by the supreme leader. But that legitimacy through direct elections is vital because the president sets the tone for that administration. At this time, we know that there's the 6 candidates who were approved. We have the top 3. I think the bottom 3, I don't think they do stand a chance. But Saeed Jalili and Mohammed Bagher Khalibaf representing, the hardline spectrum of Iranian politics. But then we also have someone new, Pezeshkian, who is the only reformist candidate and is right now, according to the latest polls, is polling in 3rd place. But inside the country, the president has a degree of independence, particularly when it comes to economic policies. But the aspect of foreign policy has always been dictated by the system in place. Instead of the role of the president, he lends his voice and opinions, but it's to a broader consensus-based decision-making process within the Supreme National Security Council. I think, but given that the top 2 candidates right now, Jalili and Mohammed Bagher, represent that conservative line of the Iranian regime, we can expect that the prevailing dynamics of Iran's foreign policy will not change or shift dramatically. The conservative candidates are likely to maintain the current approach that we saw with the late president, is focusing on security and ideological consistency rather than making any big significant changes. So while the president's influence on domestic matters, especially the economy, will be a very crucial factor in this election, certainly we saw it in the first debate. We're slowly seeing the foreign policy approaches of the top 3 candidates being laid out.
Ismaeel, in your answer there, you talked about the legitimacy in the process. And I think, turning back to Arash again, the last presidential election in 2021 saw the lowest ever turnout, with only 48% of electors bothering to cast their vote. Arash, you're someone with your finger on the pulse of Iranian society. What is the mood amongst family, friends and colleagues in Iran regarding this contest? Do you think there's going to be an increase in people who want to vote? Do they feel that there's more at stake this time?
I think there probably will be an increase, but I don't think it will be much of an increase, basically. And I think, Pezeshkian was, in many ways, I think the reformist Pezeshkian was allowed to run. And let me be also clear about something, because people get confused about this. What does it mean when we say he was the only reformist allowed to run? It doesn't mean that he's necessarily running on a reformist agenda, which he isn't, by the way. Right? He isn't really promising to reform anything, actually. In fact, if you just, it would be an interesting experiment. If you just listen to these debates with English translation and they ask you, can you tell who's the reformist candidate? I don't think you can always, because he's actually competing with saying how much he's devoted to the supreme leader and how much he wants to follow those policies. But all it means when you say reform is that he is from the two grand factions of Iranian official politics, are conservatives or principalists and reformists. He happens to come from the reformists. But I think he's not running on a reformist agenda, and something that has been surprising, actually, if you will, even for me and for many others. And the Iranian Reformist Front, which picked Pezeshkian, it was their candidate, that kind of criticized him early on for not doing that, and many others are doing the same. So look, in terms of the mood in Iranian society, obviously Iran is a diverse society. I will tell you this. I think still tons of people, the majority who didn't vote in 2021, I think vast majority of them still don't want to vote. I think they haven't found a reason to vote. Pezeshkian, as I said, is not really giving them anything. Pezeshkian, this is a choice on part of Pezeshkian. He could have gone in and tried to be barnstorming. Now, yesterday, Javad Zarif, the former Prime Minister of Rouhani, who was officially part of Pezeshkian's team, he gave a nice barnstorming speech on TV defending his agenda, which, by the way, shows you, I'm not sure I agree that there is actually foreign policy Iran runs also on the basis of some sort of a consensus in the National Security Council. That's what they say always. But in effect, we see that the most important political decisions in foreign policy is always subject to a lot of factional infighting, both when it's happening and afterwards. And Khamenei is also not someone who actually owns up to his decisions. So he supports something, and then I would say he's very cowardly, frankly, in that way, because he supports something, and then a few weeks later he says, it wasn't me, it was the diplomats who decided this. And he very famously said at the height of Iranian nuclear negotiations that I'm not a diplomat, I'm a revolutionary. Sort of not accept. And whereas in reality, he actually is very hands-on. He intervenes in the smallest decisions. Bodies appointed by him now have replaced parliament effectively. Even when it comes to things like economic policy, there are tons of bodies that are appointed by him and run things. At any rate, so I don't think Pezeshkian has done anything to really enthuse most of people who didn't vote to say, oh, this time we'll vote. But some of them would. So yes, I do know people here and there who didn't vote in 2021 but are voting now. There will be lots of ups and downs. Mehdi Karoubi, who was the House detained leader of the Green Movement in Iran in 2009, he endorsed the movement. Now that's gotta carry. I don't know how many votes that will buy, right? But it will buy some votes. Khatami has endorsed him. Zarif has endorsed him. Each of these people means something. But will it be enough to tip the balance and for Pezeshkian to win? I personally don't think so. But I don't think his winning is impossible, because then you need to get to electoral arithmetic, look at the other candidates, and he's the only one running. There's, of course, Pur Mohammadi, who is a bit of a centrist. He's unlikely, if you're a pro-reform, you're unlikely to vote for him, even though he's actually ran to the left of Pezeshkian in the debate so far, frankly, Pur Mohammadi has. But at any rate, so that means if you are the person who's a bit critical of the system but says, go to hell, whatever it is, I'll go vote that day. It might even be that, whatever, like no one needs to know, I'll just go and vote and come back home. Your only choice is Pezeshkian. So he does still have a chance, especially if the elections go to the second round. But definitely, is this an election in which, is this like 2017, for example, or 2013, where the entire Iranian society was enthused really about these polls and one way or the other, or 2009, actually. Basically, every single election, almost during my lifetime, from not every year that I was alive, my adulthood, has been a very intense political affair, except for 2021. And this one is much more like 2021 in that sense, again, as opposed to others. It has not really enthused people to come out and vote. But I do think more people will vote. And I do think the turnout has a real chance of going above 50%.
I mean, you actually anticipated my next question there quite well. You've cast a cold eye on the reformism of Masoud Pezeshkian. Among his rivals in this contest are some establishment and security figures like Mustafa Pourmohammadi that you mentioned, and also people like Mohammad Bahir Ghalibaf. I was wondering, how do you think that their previous experiences could shape their presidencies if they're successful?
We've gone like 15 minutes without mentioning Ghalibaf, which is something, because I would say that, Ghalibaf, I think he's the front runner, and I think this is his election to lose. Now, the gaps have started appearing. So who's Ghalibaf? He's the Speaker of the Parliament. He used to be a military commander during the 1980s in the war with Iraq. He was one of the key leaders of the militia called IRGC, which had an important role in fighting Iraq in the 80s, and today controls much of the Iranian economy. He's very much a Guards candidate, and he is someone who's a strong man. According to people that have known him for years, he's no ideological bone in his body. He's very much a sort of a pragmatist and technocrat in many ways, but at the same time, very conservative pro-regime course. So he's this kind of figure. But he's had a lot of corruption scandals related to him. At any rate, so Ghalibaf, what kind of president will he be? I think Ghalibaf is very clear about what he wants to be. He wants to be a strongman. He wants to be authoritarian modernizer. And he said this all his life. In the first debate on economy on Monday, he repeated the phrase strong manager. We need a strong manager, or we need a strong president, every other sentence. And in fact, when he first ran, the other thing you should know about Ghalibaf is that he's ran and failed many times before. The first time he ran and failed in 2005, he openly compared himself to Reza Shah. This is the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, a very beloved Iranian figure for many. He's a definition of an authoritarian, a strongman who modeled himself in some way after Kemal Atatürk in Turkey, a very anti-clerical figure, and of course, a boogeyman for the Islamic Republic, which was founded on overthrowing the dynasty that Reza had founded. But Ghalibaf in 2005 compared himself to Reza Shah. He boasted about his pilot license as opposed to his military background. And he wanted to, and he was mayor of Tehran for many years. He was a very technocratic mayor of Tehran. So this is the kind of figure that Ghalibaf is. And this is, so if Ghalibaf becomes president, which I think it's the most likely outcome at the moment, you are going to get a strongman wannabe with the support of the Revolutionary Guards. Now, what does that mean for the future of Iran? It's a very interesting question, because Ayatollah Khamenei, who's the supreme leader, has all the power now, but he's 85 years old. He's going to die at some point. And I think for a lot of us who have this perspective that the power is moving away from the clerics and onto the guards, this would really be realizing of that prophecy, if you will. Because if Ghalibaf gets to be president, he's going to have a lot of power to shape that outcome, the succession outcome when it comes. But at any rate, of course, there are very rocky waters of Iranian politics. Years ahead, nothing is clear. But I do think he's the front runner right now.
You talked there about the future of Iran, and I'd like to bring Ismaeel back in here, because obviously Iran plays an incredibly important role in the Middle East. I mean, Ismaeel, you've been observing the changing relationship between Tehran and neighbouring Arab countries, particularly those in the Gulf, for quite some time. And there's no doubt that regional capitals will be watching the outcome of this election very closely. How do you see Iran's nearest Arab neighbours reacting to the potential election of a hardliner versus a reformist president? And what challenges do you think they'll face, particularly from the US and Europe?
I think it's going to be more or less the same, whether Saeed Jalili or Mohammed Baqir Ghalibaf win this election. I think this three-way race, that's very likely to go into a runoff, I think, because the latest polling has shown that at least Pezeshkian has gotten at least 28% in favor in third place, but then both Jalili and Ghalibaf are splitting a 30% chunk of the electorate among each other. So it's very highly likely that we'll see a runoff election the first week of July when that comes between Pezeshkian and the hardliner group. I think for a country like Saudi Arabia, we witnessed after it was brokered by China in 2023, I think that's going to remain the same. What we have to remember is that we're still at the first phase of this détente relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We have good signs. A country like Bahrain, which was part of the countries that had long-standing issues with Iran, with the Bahrain King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa saying that they're ready to move forward in changing that relationship, increasing people-to-people relations, but on the more side following what the UAE and Saudi Arabia has agreed to. But I think there's much to be said about more confidence-building measures that needs to be followed. We're still in the very early stages. What they're seeing right now is that more or less the same. I think that they want to follow in the footsteps of Raisi and his administration's policies when it comes to moving forward. Someone like Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, regardless of who comes into the power, would want to continue on that changing relationship, because we're only several years away from realizing Saudi Vision 2030, at least the goals that were set on that ambitious project for Saudi Arabia. But part of that includes a more stable region. Right now, with Israel's ongoing war on Gaza, that has obviously changed some forms of the cards on the table. Where we saw recently the direct first Iran attacks on Israel, albeit it was measured in a lot of sense. But yeah, it's still in the early stages. I think a test of that was very recently in the Hajj, when the first times Iranians in a long time were able to perform the Hajj directly, and as well as Umrah. But part of that, the supreme leader Ali Khamenei, he gives this annual sort of speech to Iranian pilgrims, and he was instigating the sense that, this Hajj should be politicized in the name of the Palestinians who were killed by Israel. And we saw that as a sort of, not a sort of a direct backlash from the government, but there was obviously warnings from the security saying that we do not want this to be a politicized Hajj. This has to be contained. And there was a bit of a war of words between the two sides, but not as direct as we've seen them, obviously, compared to the past, certainly compared to 5 years ago. But that was, again, another test in how much each side can contain both each other, but also approach it from a win perspective, right? Another thing that I'd like to mention is that moving forward, there's still this dispute which played up in 2023 that revolves around the right of the Kuwaitis and Saudis to use the Durra field. The late President Raisi, he was very adamant in saying that regardless of what happens, we need to sit down and renegotiate the maritime borders. I think that will be a very big, significant, geopolitical or economic aspect moving forward in that terms of the relationship. Regardless of whether... Yeah, go ahead, Arash.
No, I just going to say we call it the Arash field, actually.
I was just about to say that, yes.
So it's my personal field.
From an Arab affairs perspective, which I run, the Gulf, it's called the Durra. Again, the Iranians call it the Arash field. That's just another example of how there's still differences that remain to be seen moving forward in terms of foreign policy and geopolitics. But I think it's a step-by-step process. Regardless of goes into who becomes the next president, has to work on those remaining small issues again. But in the grander scheme of things, when it comes to proxy wars, when it comes to, I think we have to also point out, and I think Arash would agree with me on this, is that because of the circumstances regarding the helicopter crash that killed Raisi, an election was always going to be held next year following the November U.S. elections. Having someone like, whether it's a Biden-Trump president, also affects how Iranians would be voting. And I think this election is going to be very interesting to watch.
Arash, turning back to you, you earlier mentioned the IRGC, which is obviously a hugely influential force in Iranian society and politics. Just last week, you were writing in The National that Masoud Pezeshkian had quickly garnered support and now counted as a serious contender. What might the reaction be to his candidacy, his presidency from the IRGC, should he be successful?
Yeah, let me just very quickly say that I do agree with Ismaeel that number one, I think the attempt to be on the good side of the GCC and reconciliation will go on regardless of who's in power. Everyone knows that it's sort of in fact, if you look at the debates, this is one of my favorite things about Iranian debates. No one ever owns up to the failures, basically the obvious failures, right? So you would be hard-pressed to find anyone support the compulsory hijabs crackdown, but also no one really supports what led to the disruption of ties with Saudi Arabia, which was the bunch of hooligans who attacked the embassy of Saudi Arabia in 2016. No one owns up to that. Everyone's happy that everyone agrees that it's good that Iran had diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. So there is that. And this was not always the case, by the way. There were times where people were really running Iranian, the Islamist revolution, traditionally, its program was that Saudi Arabia, the kingdom, has to be overthrown effectively. And that's long gone. Everyone agrees that Iran needs good ties with Saudi Arabia. Now, very good question. IRGC and Pezeshkian. I have to be honest with you. I know experts have to be all-knowing and have to say all these things. It's actually hard for me to wrap my head around what a Pezeshkian presidency would look like. It's just such an outcome that we did not. If you interviewed me in one day before Raisi crashed, and you said, "What's the chance of a reformist becoming president in Iran again?" Be it even a very docile or conservative reformist, I really wouldn't have put it at even 10%. And now it's a very real possibility. So in terms of how will IRGC react, I think that there is going to be a lot of clashes. This is it's not just because of Pezeshkian. It's because Pezeshkian has very clearly indicated he wants to bring back Zarif, his foreign minister. He wants to bring back those folks. In many ways, this might be a resurrection of Rouhani government. Now, Rouhani's political party, the Moderation and Development Party, which is not a reformist party, but I call it centrist. It is called moderation, so people use the term moderate. I don't like this term because it's a very relative term, like moderate what. But at any rate, this kind of folks will be probably back in, and they clashed hard with IRGC last time. And I think people in IRGC would like someone like Talibov, so they're likely to crash with them again. But you have to remember something. Right now, can I just say this briefly, right? We have three candidates that really tells you about three different directions. So there is the reformist Pezeshkian, which is really backed by centrists. Then there is Ghalibaf, who is IRGC and conservatives. But then there's Jalili, who are fundamentalists. That's what I call them. That's what a lot of other people call them. These are the guys who, it's interesting, in Iran, you always have more extreme. But these are the guys who seem to have no afterthought for the consequences of their policies. For example, they would like to go send goons out to repress women in Iran in the streets and actually enjoy doing it, like without any sort of a perspective of what could mean. They could really endanger Iran's diplomatic relations. They could tear up even because Iran has been secretly talking to the United States for the last few years even, and they might even endanger that, even though they don't quote oppose it publicly. At any rate, actually, against fundamentalists, there is sometimes a coalition, if you will, between these conservatives and centrist reformists. Ghalibaf, after all, became a speaker of the parliament with the support of both reformists and centrists, right? So Ghalibaf, who became a speaker of the parliament like 5 days before he ran for president, he had the support of Pezeshkian, actually, because Pezeshkian heads the reformist faction in the parliament, right? So while it is possible and likely for IRGC to clash with a President Pezeshkian, they might also come to some sort of an agreement, actually, especially if they're worried about the fundamentalists, which they really consider unsophisticated crazies. That's really how I think someone like Ghalibaf, this is how politics works, right? Ghalibaf will say all the things, but he knows he is not a fundamentalist crazy, right? He knows that there are consequences of actions. He doesn't favor attacking embassies or things like that. So while, as I said, the perspective is for some sort of a clash, there's also a world in which a President Pezeshkian will actually come into a very reconciliatory agreement with IRGC and other factions, at least on certain issues. Now, that is if they're able to divide power and the considerable fruits of power peacefully, which is not usually and always the case. And the other thing I want to emphasize again, I know it sounds crazy to talk about a presidential election and keep referring to what will happen when Khamenei dies, but that's on everyone's mind, right? That also depends on, because Khamenei now holds the system together. The question of power struggle is going to be very different the closer we get to his death and also his marginalization. The very last thing I'd say is that Ismaeel mentioned about the effect of the US elections. Absolutely. So it's on everybody's mind, right? Already in the debates, the names Trump and Biden have been mentioned a few times. And Zarif said something very interesting, for example, in his foreign policy speech yesterday in defense of Pezeshkian. And Zarif said, look, Iran has been selling oil because Biden has allowed it, not because you guys were geniuses on the Raisi administration. Iran has done it because you allowed it. But what are you going to do if Trump is back, right? And a lot of people, in fact, on the reformist sides and others are saying, vote as if Trump is president, basically. That's what they're saying. Who's going to be able to stand up to Trump and deal with Trump? And this brings me back to the question of IRGC Pezeshkian, because I think if faced with a Trump policy and God knows what Donald Trump's policy is going to be if he comes back to office, which is quite likely. God knows what his policy going to be in January and like February, right? It also changes a lot. But it is possible that whatever policy Trump has will have an effect on the relationships between the Iranian elites. It might be, for example, that centrists like Zarif and IRGC will say, okay, truce, let's agree on a plan to deal with Trump and what this represents, as opposed to if it's Biden, they'll have a different game.
Final question for both of you, and I'll start with Ismaeel. We've been projecting a lot and perhaps speculating a little about the future and tying that into specific candidacies. But overall, whoever wins, what do you think should be the number one priority for the new president and why?
I think, at the end of the day, the Iranians are going to have to vote on their priorities on the top three candidates based on two things, right? For them, they're not much, I think, interested or focused, right, rather is the word, on foreign policies, because they, again, as Arash said, is they've been told vote as if Trump is coming back to power. But the biggest priority right now for the Iranian president is to marry both domestic policies in terms of how do you tackle the economic change challenges, inflation, a stagnant unemployment growth. But that's also directly mirrored with international sanctions on Iran, and finding a foreign policy for each candidate and the way they're going to approach it whether it is with the West or what Khamenei has continuously also said in his speeches at countries like China and Russia. And if the status quo remains when it comes to sanctions, how do they prioritize at least reducing those so that they can economically lift up the Iranian population? I think that's going to be key on the next 9 days.
And Arash, what do you think the number one priority should be for whoever is the winner?
Should be, as an Iranian, put me into what I would want, which is obviously not on offer. I think if there was a true reformist president that I could support, I would want them to confront the centers of power in Iran and try to move towards democratizing Iran, really, like by fighting for their own position. That's the thing with the president, as I started saying, because it's an elected position as opposed to all the unelected positions. But that's not on the cards. But anyways, I think what is in common is that I think a president would need to move away Iran from the danger of a war. I think Iran has become too dangerously close to a war with Israel and the United States that we don't want. Iranian people don't want a war. They cannot afford a war. The last thing they want to do is a war. A president would have to move towards a rapprochement with the West, not because we love the West or not, but because it would lead to the lifting of the sanctions, which is necessary for Iran to be able to have better economic conditions. Iranian economy has been terrible. The only way to fixing it is by lifting of the sanctions. Again, something that both Ghalibaf and Pezeshkian agree on. Not their opponents. Their opponents live in a land in which Iran can be autarkic and continue to survive. That's not really the case. And of course, a president would also need to bring some sort of to use this Pollyanna word, national reconciliation, which is another way of saying, I just saw a tweet before coming on here, which said, there's a reason I don't vote. I have a good reason I don't vote. I just hate this guy so much, which is, I think, the perspective of much of Iranian society. People really hate their rulers, and that's not tenable for any society. It erodes national trust. We used to say in Iran, people don't even obey traffic rules because they don't like the powers that be, right? So it has really corrosive effect for society. Yeah, so to sum it up again, I think what the president would need to do is to try to keep Iran away from war, to bring about more domestic peace, if you will, by lessening the repression, giving more room for people to express themselves. And all of this, of course, matters because it's a very crucial time in Iranian history and very much a transitory moment.
That seems like a good place to leave it for now. I'm sure you'll both continue to watch events unfold in Iran very closely. But for now, Arash Azizi and Ismaeel Naar, thank you so much for joining us on the year of elections. Thanks a lot for listening. Please follow and subscribe to get all the latest episodes as soon as they come out. This episode was produced by Dua Farid and Aaron Myers, and I'm your host, Declan McVeigh.